Okay, so affordability and value, right? We've talked about the environment, we've talked about eco-friendly, we just talked about how Gen Y goes about getting into the market and investigating where or what to buy. A common theme that I just heard over the last two presenters is that, you know, you want an eco-friendly vehicle, but you don't necessarily want to have to pay for it. So I'm really interested to hear from the folks at USC to come talk to us about affordability and value and its impact on the decision-making process. So Brad Geschird and Ryan Nauert, come on up. The stage is yours. Okay, sorry. Come on up, guys.
Welcome. We're the University of Southern California Marshall School of Business team. I'm a 1998 Honda Prelude Type SH. In the garage, we have a 2003 Infiniti G35 sedan, 2006 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon, and on deck we have a 2005 Toyota Camry LE. We're here to discuss with you the perceptions of value for Gen Y. Now, we are tasked with developing an understanding of how Gen Y considers value in the vehicle purchase decision-making process. So for our methodology, we analyzed the Deloitte survey, which had 1,100 respondents, and supplemented that with our own survey, which had approximately 100 respondents. Now, what we did was we analyzed all of that data with respect to 5 categories: financing, new versus used, content and status, country of origin, and ownership experience. Now, as we analyzed that data, it became clear to us that there were distinct subgroups within Gen Y, and they could not be looked at as a cohesive group. So first, let's start with why Gen Y. Well, as Dr. Kit Yarrow said, Gen Y has been influential for all consumers, not just fellow Gen Y. And they'll also be the high-income purchasers of the future. So some of the characteristics of Gen Y is they're tech-savvy. They might be using iPods and iPhones and whatnot. They're influential. They're connected. They're using social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc. They're skeptical. They have a sense of entitlement. And lastly, they're aspirational. So how does that tie in? How do those characteristics tie in with the prompts that we had? Well, first we'll start with financing. Now, while the majority of Gen Y has a good understanding of their vehicle purchasing options, a large chunk of them do not. A full 1/3 do not have that sense. Now, this is likely the largest purchasing decision they'll be making up to this point in their lifetime. So it's fairly significant. Perhaps because of this, they want a more transparent process with a closer alignment of MSRP to transaction prices, rather transaction prices to MSRP. Now, once they've made that decision to, say, purchase a car versus lease a car, they might be looking at whether they should go for a new vehicle or a used vehicle. Now, from the data we had, showed that they're pretty much split on this. They're about 50-50. However, one thing they did agree on is that they'd rather have a used car with a higher level of features than a new car with a lower level of features. For example, sometimes friends would come up to me and say, hey, Cap, should I get this Honda Civic for $20,000, or should I spend that same $20,000 and buy an Acura TL or TSX that's used, that has the Bluetooth, the leather, the navigation, etc. Now, in addition to that content and status, in that vein, you know, just like how we had introduced ourselves by our cars, Gen Y wants their vehicle to emulate their lifestyle. They want their car to represent themselves. So they're willing to pay more for a car that will give them that, you know, aura of individuality that will represent what they want. But of course, certain characteristics, for instance, like environmental, they want, you know, as you heard from the other groups, they want the vehicle to be able to justify that additional amount that they'd spend. Now, in addition to content status, they're also looking at the country of origin for these vehicles. Now, they do prefer import brands. However, they do also prefer the vehicles to be manufactured in the United States, as you heard before. Now, that preference for import brands has a positive correlation, we saw, with income levels and education levels. Now, once they've decided what car they want to get, and they're ready to go into the dealership, brings us to the last point, ownership experience. Now, over half the respondents prefer a less personal experience. They'd rather go through the internet, utilizing that, versus going in and talking to the salesperson in person. Now, more troubling, a whole full quarter of those respondents actually removed the brand from their evoked set because of a bad dealership experience. One example of that, I had a friend who wanted a certain brand of car. They were dead set on the exact car they wanted to buy. But when they went into the dealership, they had a bad experience with the salesperson. And you might think that, okay, then maybe they'll go to a different dealership for that same brand. But rather than doing that, they just removed that whole brand from their Vogt set and went to a different brand altogether. So that's definitely a troubling statistic. However, understanding Gen Y as a whole isn't enough. Gen Y has a short attention span and rapidly changing preferences. Now, as you can see, almost 60% of them do not plan to be driving the same brand of vehicle in 5 years that they currently drive. Furthermore, Gen Y is the least brand loyal of any generation of American consumers. So what does this mean for automakers? Well, they have to target Gen Y, target that consumer base at different stages of Gen Y. So because of this, we decided to dig deeper and see what sub-profiles exist within Gen Y. So as we went through it, we discovered out of the hundreds of different data points, there were 7 attributes that helped us gain a deep understanding of what their perceptions are on value. Now these attributes were age, income, education level, their employment status, family status, marital status, and finally whether they're located geographically in rural or urban areas. Now, once we had these 7 attributes, we used them to create 10 distinct profiles with different perceptions of value. We then assigned them colloquial names like Stevie Student, Freddie First Job, and the Huxtables. Now, Freddie First Job, as you can imagine, is a full-time student under the age of 24. Freddie First Job is also under the age of 24, but he's now graduated and he's working his first job. The Huxtables, on the other hand, are a married couple with children. They perhaps live in a brownstone. Father's a doctor, enjoys Jell-O pudding perhaps. Now, we took these 10 profile groups and we plotted them with income on the y-axis and age on the x-axis, using color coding to indicate their family and marital status. However, with these 10 different distinct profiles, where should automakers focus their attention? Here to discuss that further is 2005 Toyota Camry.